Very special thanks once again to Cars of Somerset for providing the vehicle in this review, and of course, as I always like to do, I've linked to their current stock page down in the video description, so if you want to check out the cars that they've got, or perhaps even commission them to find you one, of course, click that link and check out the details therein. When it comes to modern production cars, say most things from the post-2000s, but especially in the performance car category, I don't think many people would argue that the Audi R8 is one of the best looking cars on the road. In my opinion, it's a stunning looking car, and even though there is a curious thing for me wherein I've never actually wanted to own one, but kind of like a piece of art in a museum, you might not want it on your own wall, but you still appreciate looking at it. For me, that's what it's like with the R8. I think it is a drivable piece of art. It's a very futuristic, almost technological approach to beauty. A very German approach, you could say, but a stunning car nonetheless. In fact, I would put it up there with stuff like Aston's and even my own Jag, the XKR, which I also think is one of the best looking cars on the road. The question that I want to answer in this video though, or at least one of the questions, is the one posed in the thumbnail. Is this Germany's ultimate answer to the established Italian exotica from, for instance, Ferrari, of course technically Audi's own Lamborghini and Maserati, but even beyond that to other countries as well? The reason why I would say yes, in fact even more so than something as iconic as the Porsche 911, is because one of the reasons the Porsche 911 in all of its forms is so good is because it's so different. That rear engine layout alone immediately sets it apart from so much else in the pack. The physical proportions of the car are also, at least until very recently, much more compact, especially in terms of width, than most super sports or supercars are. They tend to be very low, very wide and very squat. The 911 isn't. The roofline is a little bit higher, the car itself is a little bit narrower, and it's all the better for it. It makes it a really good car. And my favourite of those that I've reviewed so far was the relatively recent 997.2 version. The reason why to me this Audi is even more of a threat to Italy is because it doesn't revolutionise the game. It beats them at their own game. It's not rear engine, it's not this alternative thinking, it's a mid-engine car. It has a wheel drive like Lambos do, for obvious reasons. It has a V10, that super exotic style of engine, which no 911 has ever had. They do have unique engines for sure, but a V10 is just, it's on that level of being an extreme motor, and there aren't that many cars on a production scale which have even had them. But look at the company it keeps. Lexus LFA, Porsche Carrera GT, even some of Audi's other models. It's a beast of an engine, and it's one of my favourite things about this car. The looks can easily rival anything from Italy, and the sheer performance of course can as well. Now this one technically is slower, being the open top. The 0 to 60 is 4 seconds dead, and the top speed is, strangely enough, electronically limited for some weird reason to 193 miles an hour. I don't really understand why you need a limiter once you get up to that kind of territory. Maybe they don't want people's heads coming off in high winds, but for whatever reason, that is the limiter. Not exactly lacking for performance. Now, of course, you've got the V8 with that 4.2, and the early V8 from around like 2006, 2007 is actually my personal favourite version of the Audi R8, at least to look at. I love the quad exhausts, the simpler, curvier bodywork, before it started to get updated. But speaking of updates, this is technically the facelifted car, even though in passing you could be forgiven for not noticing that, because the first generation R8 ran from around 2006 to 2015, and that was the Type 4.2 version technically. Within that time though, in 2012, there was a minor facelift, which of course slightly changed the styling. One of the ways that you can tell the difference is actually the headlights, but it also of course updated some of the technical side of things. And as I've said in other reviews, facelifting a car tends to be actually a good idea, because it's not just a marketing gimmick, or at least when it's done well it's not. It's actually a way of ironing out some of the issues that the car originally had. So if you are going to get an R8, well, chances are this is probably the one to go for if you like that more classic shape of the car. To me, from 2015 onward, called the Type 4S, with the much boxier back end and the triangle cutouts in the front bumper. I'm not as much of a fan, to be honest. To me, that looks like it's trying a bit too hard to be aggressive, whereas I prefer the sleeker, curvier prettiness of these cars. Now, there are a number of options with the R8, which, like a 911, give another huge level of personalization and, you could say, advantage over some other cars as well. See, Italy, for instance, with older Ferraris like the F355, you had those gorgeous open-gated manual shifters, and even though anyone who follows the channel knows I am not by any stretch a fan of manual cars for a number of reasons, that was still the Ferrari thing. And a number of supercars, in fact the majority from the 90s, were manuals. Your F40s, your McLaren F1s, your XJ220s, even Lambo's own like the Diablo. Now though, even something like Ferrari, they've gone to paddles with buttons for automatic mode. And even though for me that's great, I would understand why for a lot of traditionalists they wouldn't like that. Audi overcame that by offering multiple choices. You've got the manual. Even in the V10 car you can have a 6-speed manual box with that gated shifter, or you can have what I was using here, the 7-speed S-Tronic, which has of course the paddles and kind of a semi-automatic feel where you do still kind of have a shifter that you move around, but only to put it into drive and neutral, etc. It's just visually designed to simulate a manual. Personally, I love it. And to highlight one of the reasons why I prefer automatics, the auto version is quicker. In both of its forms, either with paddles or in sport mode, it is quicker than the manual, and it's also more efficient with that extra gear as well. Now, one of the things that I want to touch on in this video is actually one of the points which some people might not like to hear. And this is a very personal thing. See, with my reviews, I like to first and foremost be objective. That means personal preference to one side, just talk facts, present people with the information that they need to know that can't really be brought down to opinion. It's just what it is. What I also like to put in there as well, of course, and this is really the purpose of any good review, is some subjective recommendations and opinions as well. So in other words, take those facts and then tell people what they actually feel like in practice, at least in your experience, or in this case, in my experience. This is where my issue with the car comes in. See, I've driven mid-engine cars on the channel before, such as the BMW i8 and the Porsche Boxster. This one to me is actually a car which I think I would prefer if it wasn't mid-engine. And the reason why is, I will freely admit, all down to personal preference. And partially due to me having, you could say, wrong expectations, but I will argue fairly justified expectations given my past history of reviewing cars. See, when I came to reviewing this R8, what I was expecting is something which evoked my time in the Porsche 997 or even something like a Nissan GT-R, wherein it's a car with great engineering, tons of helpful technology packed in there, of course the advantage of all-wheel drive, and almost, to me at least, gave off this vibe of being, as far as supercars go, one of the more forgiving ones. And even a race driver like Jackie Ickx said that he considers the Audi R8, or at least at the time, to be the best handling road car you could buy. So clearly I am in the minority, but the reason why I'm not a fan of it is because the all-wheel drive, in the case of this one, doesn't really feel like it does anything at all. It doesn't feel like an all-wheel drive car. It may as well be rear-wheel drive all of the time from my experience, even at normal driving speeds, but the real reason why I'm not a fan of mid-engine layouts is the lack of feel. See, technically having the engine in the centre is good for weight distribution, and on a track, I'm sure I would have a huge amount of fun with this car, but on the road, especially when I compare it to my own Jaguar, the XKR that I arrived for this review in and of course left in afterward, the Jaguar, and many other cars like it, just have endless driver feedback. You know exactly what the car is feeling, if you will. The car never really surprises you. It's a predictable car, and it's all the better for it. A mid-engine car, and many professional drivers will tell you as much, is less predictable, especially when it comes to sliding out. They tend to just go. And to me, that's not a feeling I want to have in a 520 horsepower, basically 200 mile an hour car. And again, that's my personal preference. I have no doubt, I would even bet money on the fact that the vast, even overwhelming majority of people who drove an R8, be it the V10, the V10 Plus, the V8, whatever, would probably love the handling and love that mid-engine layout. For me, it's just not my thing. I've driven a few performance Audis in this series, including the S3, the RS4, the RS6, and this one, and the RS6 to me was the most fun I've had so far, which sounds ridiculous to say, but it's because, as I said, it suited more of my style. I like a car that gives you a lot of feedback, something which feels stable. If I'm paying this kind of money for a car, I don't want to feel like I'm constantly in a battle of wits with it, or trying to figure out what the car is really thinking, or what it's going to do next. If you want a challenge, or if you want something that feels surprisingly old school, then yeah, I can strongly recommend the R8 because it surprised me by how raw and old school it felt. Because in comparison to what I was expecting it to be like, such as that rear engine 911 or the always helpful Nissan GT-R which does most of the work for you, it's nothing like either of those. If you're looking for something which is more predictable and feels more safe, then I can recommend a 911 or a GT-R over an Audi R8. If, however, you're looking for something which has a surprising similarity to what you'd assume most Italians would feel like a 90s Lambo, then yeah, the Audi R8 actually delivers quite a lot of that. Now, another issue that I had with the car, and of course this brings me to something which I always need to talk about for obvious practical reasons, is the space. And this is a pro and con argument because, for the most part, I like the interior. The legroom is actually really good, the shifter is fun to use, I'm a big fan of Audi's steering wheel design, there's a lot of things that I like. However, the headroom is horrendous. There's no two ways of saying it. I believe that if this was the coupe, I probably couldn't have even done this review because my back would have been hurting so much, it honestly would have been worse than when I reviewed the MG TF. Now, of course, with the convertible, it's not an issue, except it's an issue if you crash, because my head is well above that roofline, and I do not trust that windshield to save me, especially not if my head's above it anyway. So again, for a taller driver, for me being 6'3", so if you're over 6 feet, it's something that you're going to want to bear in mind. If you live in a sunny climate, maybe even the States, like California or something, sure, go for it. You'll probably only drive it in sunny conditions anyway. But in the UK, for sure, it's something that you want to keep in mind if you are a taller driver. And it's kind of interesting because it's not usual for me to have a car where my legs had plenty of space, but my head didn't. Usually those two things are fairly complementary, but in this one there's a little bit of an offset because of just how squat the car is, very much so like a race car. And again, that brings me back to what I think some people will love about the car and what some people, maybe with sensibilities more similar to my own, wherein I personally prefer more of a GT style machine, like a 2+2 Maserati or Jag, that's more my kind of thing, is that the simplest way to describe driving one of these, and again I can't speak to the V8 version because I haven't tested that yet, but at least when it comes to this really high revving V10 with, of course, as I said, 520 horsepower, peak power incidentally is at 8,000 RPM, so it needs to be worked hard. The torque is not very high, unsurprisingly, 391 pound-feet, and even that is at 6,500 RPM, so to get the best out of it you really do have to rev it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's a nice sounding engine, but this car, if you took exactly what this car is, even in its convertible form, if you teleported it back 30 or 40 years to, what, the 70s, or even the 60s, this would have been better than every single race car you could imagine. It would have probably beaten most GT class race cars on the track, and probably even some Formula cars of the time. Today it's just a road car that you can buy, and anyone can own. That's the kind of crazy time jump in technology and performance, but it highlights my point. Not literally that it could beat every car of the time, of course, there are Can-Am cars with 1,000 horsepower, etc. But the issue is, this is a race car experience. And if you go into it expecting what I did, which is a forgiving car, it's not what you're going to get. At least in my experience. And again, that could be down to the particular car. Of course, it may have needed new tyres on the front end. There are a number of small variables which can change very drastically the way a car feels. And as I said, I'm fully aware that I will be in the minority when it comes to not liking the handling signature, but to me it was just a combination of a lack of feel over the front end and a fairly unsatisfactory weight split, which to me kind of belies having a mid-engine layout at all. Yes, it's cool to have it in the middle, but when it's not a 50-50 split, and this is nowhere near a 50-50 split, well, to me that kind of negates the point of having it in the middle in the first place. This only has 44% of its weight over the front end, 56% over the back. That's not even close to a centre split. Whereas if you compare that to something like Audi's RS4, of for example the B7 generation with that manual gearbox where the engine is right at the front of the car with all-wheel drive, well, it's fairly universally loved for its handling. Now, it's not the same tier of car, of course, but there is an R8 with that same engine and similar levels of performance, and I think I might actually like that one even more. However, the mid-engine layout just isn't for me. As I said, I'm sure some people will love it, but from my experience and my tastes so far, in comparison to the front-engine cars that I've driven that were both four-wheel drive, well, all-wheel drive, or rear-wheel drive, even something like an AMG GTS, for example, well, they are more my style. With that being said though, there's certainly a lot to love about this car. The performance is fantastic, the looks are stunning, the sound is incredible, and even the value for money, this one is, what, about the mid 50 grand region, and that's the kind of price you should be expecting to pay for a good one, between 50 and 60. So it is a lot of car for the money, and the unarguable point that kind of conquers all is that it gives you all of this for a lower price than a much older Gallardo. And it's a faster car than a Gallardo, and many would argue probably at least as cool to look at. But overall, that's it for my thoughts on the R8 V10 Spider in its slightly facelifted form from 2014. And of course, stick around on the channel for more reviews. Tell me down below if you are or were an owner of an R8. Do you agree or disagree with some of my points? I'm sure this will be one of the more controversial episodes that I've done because of my feelings on the handling, but if you want to check out my other reviews, of course you can click here on screen to do that, and until next time I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.